What's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's episode of the Well Man's Podcast. My name is Brian Brosey. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Dr. Keoni Tita. Keoni, how are you today?
Doing wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for listening to us once again. Brian and I were just saying that we wish we would have done this one early on when we started doing these podcasts. But today we're just going to just give a basic overview about sweeteners and hopefully clear up some of the misconceptions that surround them.
Yeah.
So I think one of the best ways to start with that is to really define what sweeteners are.
Yeah, we're not just talking about carbohydrates, right, Keoni, or are we?
Right. And so we are, right? And sweeteners will fall under that to some extent, but you'll see that even that doesn't fit so much with some of the sweeteners out there, as because some sweeteners are, their base unit is actually protein. Some of the things that you find in your food. So it's not just all carbohydrate, but carbohydrates are a catch-all term for glucose, which is a monosaccharide, sucrose, which is a disaccharide, two sugar molecules together. Define that a little bit more. And then also starch, the stuff that you would find in like potatoes or starchy vegetables like corn and things like that. Starch is kind of like the storage form of sugar that plants make and that we consume. So through the process of photosynthesis, a lot of plants store energy in the form of carbohydrate, and we as humans get the benefit of that through eating green leafies and tubers like yams, potatoes, and things like that. And some of those plants, a lot of these plants that store this carbohydrate, we also can get sweeteners from them that don't necessarily fall under the strict definition of what a true carbohydrate is. So we'll go over that. One of the ways sweeteners are defined, and I'm sure a lot of people out there, especially in the health and fitness world, have heard of what the glycemic index is, and it's basically a number of whatever food you're looking at from 0 to 100, and the base is pure glucose, which is given the arbitrary value of 100, and it represents the rise in blood glucose 2 hours after consuming that food. And then you contrast that with glycemic load, which I think even now you really get into a little bit more detail about how that food may be affecting you. But glycemic load is based on the glycemic index, and it's calculated by multiplying the grams of available carbohydrate. So if you have 20 grams of carbohydrate in the food, you multiply that by the food's glycemic index and then divide it by 100. So it gives you a better idea of the load of sugar you're getting at that meal based on what you're eating, that food. Anyway, those are two terms that can tell you a lot about your food. Diabetics are very familiar with glycemic index.
Right.
It's pretty much known that you want to eat low glycemic index foods.
Yeah.
And you also want to keep your glycemic load down too by not eating too much of those foods.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to back up a second, Keoni, and just ask, so for this episode, what is our kind of our working definition of sweeteners then here?
So the working definition of sweeteners are basically anything that tastes sweet.
All right.
So that doesn't
was a hard question.
Right. But it's a good question because it's not, a lot of people, when they hear sweet, they think sugar, they think carbohydrate. And, a lot of the sweeteners that are put in our food don't fit that definition, so to speak. All right.
Okay.
Because you have things like sugar alcohols.
Right.
You have synthetic sweeteners. You have other sweeteners that are on the market that just taste sweet, but are actually made up of protein molecules, So anyway, that's the basics for it. But let's go through some of these things. And I guess one of the things I want to start with is, what is the difference between sucrose and high fructose corn syrup? Because I hear this a lot, that sucrose, table sugar, is much better for you than high fructose corn syrup. But when you actually look and see what is in that, they're pretty much the same. All right. So we know that sucrose, a disaccharide, contains 50% fructose, monosaccharide. That's fruit sugar, um, for the most part. I mean, and then 50% glucose. So it's 1-to-1 ratio. One fructose molecule to one glucose molecule, you get 50%, 50%. And then when you look at high fructose corn syrup, and chemically, high fructose corn syrup is designated a lot of times on packaging or in industry. It's like high fructose corn syrup 55 or high fructose corn syrup 90, high fructose corn syrup 42. And what that number basically means, the 55, is the percentage of fructose in there. The rest, like if it's high fructose corn syrup 55, the rest 45 is glucose. It's essentially the same. It's essentially the same as table sugar. Now, if you get up to high fructose corn syrup 90, then yes, you have 90% fructose. All right. And now it's a whole different animal, and how, basically your body metabolizes is completely different. But standard high fructose corn syrup basically, is metabolized the way sucrose is, regular table sugar. And I just want to bring that up because a lot of people say, oh, avoid high fructose corn syrup. But, the science just basically says they're essentially the same thing. They're metabolized, in the same way for the
Okay,
most
so
part.
there's not much to be afraid of there.
Well, there is if you're getting, you want to be careful if you're getting like high fructose corn syrup 90, where it's 90% fructose. And the issue with that is fructose is metabolized differently from glucose. All right. And glucose, basically, when it gets into your bloodstream, it's transported throughout your body and is metabolized by all your cells without having to be processed by your liver, where fructose is primarily metabolized. All right. And
Glucose is the one that's used quicker.
Yes,
right?
it's used quicker, and glucose will spike your blood sugar, and will also spike your insulin. But the thing about fructose is one of the reasons why it's used, or was used, especially in the health and fitness world, as a substitute for sucrose, is because it has a very low glycemic index. All right, compared to glucose, which is 100. We know glucose after 2 hours spikes your blood sugar, much more so than fructose. But what people fail to really understand is how fructose is metabolized. And it's metabolized through the liver. And even though it doesn't spike your blood sugar as much as glucose does, it will spike your insulin and has more of a correlation with fatty liver and obesity and insulin resistance than glucose does. All right.
Okay.
And that's just basically, without getting into the details, that's basically how it's, due to the way it's metabolized. So that's where it kind of got a bad rap, and that's where high fructose corn syrup kind of got a bad rap.
And what was, if we stated it, but what was kind of the cutoff for high fructose corn syrup? Like you mentioned, you don't want that high fructose corn syrup 90, where it's a lot more of the fructose, correct?
Yeah, you want to be careful with that. But let me say from the outset, the reason why I want to talk about sweeteners is because with my patients, all sweeteners, whether natural, artificial, I want my patients to get away from the sweet taste, and certainly when they're going to eat carbohydrate, I want them to eat the carbohydrate that is, coming from tubers like sweet potatoes, that type of thing. And one of the reasons why, Brian, is because these things have much more of a satiating effect than, these more refined sweeteners. But I mean, white potato is more satiating. Almost is one of the most satiating foods you can eat. That says a lot about, what that signals it's sending to your brain and maintaining an appropriate weight. Okay. It also says a lot about our evolutionary history and past with eating tubers and these starchy vegetables. I mean, modern day hunter gatherers, we know, like, part of the mainstay of their diet are starchy vegetables. And there's a lot of energy packed into them. But some modern day hunter gatherers eat starchy vegetables all day, slim, trim, no cardiovascular disease, so on and so on. So it goes back to that whole notion, whole foods, the wholer the better. As soon as you start refining them, you're starting to get into trouble. So sucrose is very refined, right?
Okay.
High fructose corn syrup is very refined. And then that brings me to the next sweetener I want to talk about is honey. And the nice thing about honey is that, kind of has a halo effect for sure, because it's natural. Especially if you are getting it from a natural source. But unfortunately, a lot of honey on the market and the food stores is cut with high fructose corn syrup, which is unfortunate. But honey is one of those things. It has glucose in it, and fructose. I think it's mostly glucose, but it has fructose in it, and also has sucrose in it, as well as some other things in it that may be beneficial, like may have pollen granules and things like that. But essentially, it's a great sweetener. And if I had to rank the sweeteners as far as like which one is better overall for the average person, I would say honey is probably a good way to go. And again, I tell people that this is what our ancestors basically grew up with, evolved with, and this is kind of a sweetener you want to use. But again, using it to excess, it's a high energy carbohydrate, and for the standard American Western diet, it's going to get you fat just like any other sugar will.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to say this. I recently read a wonderful book, and I'd love to have this guy on our podcast at some point. But the book was called Burn. It's just out. I think it's a guy named Harry Ponser. I think he's out of the University of UNC or maybe Duke. Anyway, the book is great, and he's an anthropologist, and he followed a group of people around called the Hadza in Africa, and when asked what their favorite food is, they say honey. Without a doubt, because, and it makes sense, right? Because all the foods they probably eat, they're not processed. So they're probably not tantalizing or tingling to the taste buds. So you don't get this overload. They don't get an overload of sugar. But when they come across honey, they drink that stuff like we would drink water. And these people are slim, trim, no evidence of cardiovascular disease or anything from the carbohydrate. And I want to bring that up because I know carbohydrates now are the macronutrient that has the, it's the bad macronutrient. Now we kind of cycle through them every 20 years. Once it's protein, then it's fat, and then it's carbohydrate. And I think we said early on that, we need to stop demonizing certain whole groups of macronutrients, because if we really get down to it and we're really honest with ourselves and then we really look at the science, we see that humans are omnivores, period, and our diets are much higher in carbohydrate than some of the Paleolithic gurus out there or ketogenic diet gurus out there would say. So anyway, that's a great book. It's called Burn. I recommend people check that book out. It's wonderful. I think it kind of brings everybody who has a modicum of education on nutrition should read.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, where were we? We were talking about honey. So honey is a good one if you get a pure source of it. But again, will get you fat like any other sweetener. It will raise your blood sugar, can raise insulin levels. So if you're going to use a sweetener, these things should all be used, kind of like as a condiment if you're basically going to use them.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. So honey is, I think the exact percentages, and it varies based on the honey, but it's like 35% glucose, 40% fructose, and then about 9 to 10, 11% sucrose. And then the rest are other simple carbs. Most fruit. So we talked about fructose, and people call it fruit sugar. That's not actually exactly true, because most fruit is about half glucose, half fructose. So it's really like sucrose. So there's something for people to realize. Now, you've been to a restaurant, right? And you've seen these little packets of I don't know.
Yep.
Sweeteners.
Yeah, no free shout outs.
Yeah. I mean, there's packages of sweeteners like
Uh-huh.
what do they call some of these?
Splenda, True,
Yeah,
or
Splenda,
Truly's
that
drink.
type of thing. And it's funny when you really look at these packets. I think Splenda, I could be wrong here, but I think Splenda is mostly sucralose, which is an artificial sweetener, so it's a synthetic sweetener. But when you look at the packet, and by the way, it has a glycemic index of 0. That's why these sweeteners are used. So there is some research that shows that it can help people control their blood sugar and that type of thing to some extent. But when you look at it, some of these are packaged with something called maltodextrin.
Mm.
Well, that's crazy because maltodextrin in itself has a glycemic index higher than, you guessed it, glucose. And it has a glycemic index of 110. So
Wow.
some of these people that, yeah, right. I mean, it's kind of like, all right, so you look at the package that says sugar and you're like, oh, I'm going to do my sucralose or my 0 glycemic index artificial sweetener. And then when you really look at it, it has maltodextrin in there. And maltodextrin is just a combination of glucose molecules bound chemically in a certain way. All right. So there's no, it sounds like a chemical name that in itself is synthetic, which it's not exactly. I mean, it is made industrially, but I'm pretty sure it's found in nature also. But it has a higher glycemic index than glucose.
The sugar you're trying to avoid.
The sugar you're trying to avoid. Yes. Yep. Other sugars that are basically glucose molecules is maltose. That's just 2 glucose molecules. So it's a disaccharide of 2 glucose molecules. Has a glycemic index of 105. And then there's another one as opposed to maltodextrin, we call it dextrose. And dextrose, do you remember in chemistry where you'd have the D isomer of a chemical compound and the L isomer of the chemical compound? Well, dextrose is just the D isomer of glucose as opposed to the L isomer of glucose. And that makes a difference, actually, to some extent. But since it is dextrose and it is all D-glucose, it still has a glycemic index of 100, like regular glucose, which is a mix of D and L. I bet you want to know all that, right, Brian? Too much information.
Yeah. Jotting notes furiously.
Right. There's another glucose sweetener out there called trehalose. And again, that's glucose molecules bound up to different bonds in a different way. It's just a chemical configuration of glucose molecules. And that one actually has a glycemic index lower than regular glucose.
Thank God, finally we're in the green.
Right. What about caramel? You seen caramel in ingredients?
Yes.
Basically, that's the browning of sugar, and certain sugars brown, including granulated fructose, including granulated glucose, and you basically brown it and create this syrupy stuff added into candies and stuff. It's basically sugar. It's basically the same thing as something called golden syrup. Those are kind of the same thing, but you'll see that one out there also.
What about things like stevia? Is that a
yeah, we'll get to that. Let's talk about, before we get there, let's talk about some other natural sweeteners though. How about agave before we get there? You heard
tequila.
of agave, right? Yep.
Yeah,
it's made with tequila, and it's marketed as like a health sweetener. Yeah. And the reason why, again, it's like 75 to 90%, depending on where it's grown, of fructose and how it's grown. It has a very low glycemic index, but man, talking about stress on your liver and insulin resistance and adding to the obesity issues and the way it's metabolized, it's not a great sweetener to go for. And, again, it's fine if you use it in small amounts. Okay. Yeah. So, how about another natural sweetener? And this one kind of hits home for me. One of my favorite plants, it's actually in some cultures called the tree of life, and that is the palm tree or the coconut palm, all of which palm sugar is derived from, as well as palm fat, fatteners and things like that. But we're talking specifically about the sugar derived from this plant. So yes, even the plant that you get your coconuts from you can get sugar. It is a natural sugar. It was marketed. I remember years ago when it first came onto the market, I remember it was marketed as being like on the label. I read this and I said, that is absolutely wrong, where it said it was like 90% inulin, which is another sweetener, but is actually a sugar fiber that has some sweetness to it. And that was completely misinformation on the label of that food, because really coconut sugar is like honey. It's a mix of sucrose, glucose, and fructose. So yes, you're not, you do a lot of coconut sugar, which I love the taste of it. It has a neat, nice like aftertaste to me, but you certainly can overdo it. And yes, you're going to get fat off of you overdo it, especially when you combine it in baked goods and so on and so on.
You go into selecting your favorite tree, Keoni. What are some of the qualities you look for in a good tree?
In a good tree?
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Well, how much use you get out of the tree, for one thing.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So we know from the coconut palm, you get lots of sugar, and you can also get palm oil, right? Which is lots of fats that can be added to a lot of foods there. And plus, who doesn't love coconut? I mean, I like coconut in everything.
Yeah, I do too.
But that tree traditionally, and the fruit that comes off of it, and there's all different types of palm trees, but traditionally it's been used in culture, especially around the equator, for all different kinds of uses. So that's why it kind of got the moniker tree of life in a lot of cultures, because it gives so much to us. So that's one of the reasons.
That was a good reason.
And the other reason also is man, you want to make a delicious treat. Make my I think we talked about this on our dessert episode, our chocolate, my chocolate mousse with cocoa and coconut milk and coconut sugar. Those three ingredients mix up, delicious, a hedonistic pleasure. So it's a good one.
Yeah.
All right, what else about some sweeteners that people may not heard of? I mean, I'll just bring it up just because it's a natural sweetener. It's called Yacon Syrup. It's basically comes from South America, and it is one of those things that it's basically derived from like tuberous roots of the Yacon plant. It's indigenous to the Andes. It has a lot of nutritional properties. It has few calories and low sugar levels. It's been used traditionally for people with diabetes, and it's considered an anti-diabetic herb. Now, this one is, the reason why is because it contains up to 50% of what we call FOS, fructooligosaccharides. And you can think about these as basically FOS being food for your gut bacteria. It does not increase your blood glucose, but it does contain some free fructose, about 35 to 25%. So it's it's one that we may want to think about.
Are those FOS or FEAS very common in other fruits or syrups or sweeteners? Whatever.
Yeah, and what was? Have you seen the ingredient inulin? Have you seen that?
No, I can't say I have.
All right. Well, inulin is a type of FOS. It's basically a prebiotic sugar fiber. It's found in chicory root. So it has a slight sweet taste and has a glycemic index of about 1, which is great.
Yeah.
You'll see that if you look for it. Some health foods will have that in there. I think there's some protein bars out there that are kind of sweetened or packed full of fiber with inulin, because it will count towards your fiber content. So that's another one. All right, let's go into, I think you brought up sugar alcohols. So let's just talk about that, because that's something we've talked about on this podcast, and there's some neat things about it. These are all natural sweeteners. One that I'm sure you heard of is xylitol, right? Xylitol is a sugar alcohol. It does have a glycemic index of about 12. So, it's very good as far as somebody trying to keep their blood sugar levels down. It's put in chewing gums a lot. It has been shown to inhibit the bacteria on your teeth that cause cavities. So you can prevent cavities by chewing gum with xylitol. In fact, most sugar alcohols do this, but xylitol has the most research on it. Another one you probably heard of is sorbitol. That's another chewing gum sweetener. But one of my favorites is erythritol. Okay, and the reason why I like erythritol is because unlike the other sugar alcohols, this one does not have an osmotic effect on the gut. So if you take a lot of xylitol or sorbitol or mannitol, maltodextrin, these sugar alcohols, and eat them, you'll find a lot of these like sweetened chocolates, like low sugar chocolates. And what they do is they just give you diarrhea and make you gassy and bloated. And in fact, in my clinic for constipation, I will use some of these sugar alcohols to get the bowels moving. And they're used in that way. But erythritol gets absorbed into the bloodstream, so it doesn't really give you that effect. And then it gets excreted primarily through the kidneys. So that's a really good one. And that one is combined with some of these natural packets you see in the store. Like sometimes you'll see right beside your, I don't know, sucralose Splenda packets, your synthetic sugar packets, you'll see right beside them maybe a Truvia packet, which is more of a natural sweetener. And you can find Truvia, you've heard of Truvia, right? You can find this at the food store. This is more of a natural sweetener. It's a combination of a compound that's found in stevia, which we'll talk about, and then in conjunction with erythritol. And it has it's almost, you really don't know the difference. It's like a 1-to-1 comparison for regular table sugar. In fact, it's when you look at it gram per gram, it's much, much sweeter than table sugar. So Truvia, I'm sure people have heard that. It's erythritol and stevia. Which is another one. Well, since we brought up stevia, let's just talk about that because I know we see that one quite a bit, right? Stevia is another South American plant. Another name for it is called sweet leaf. And it is a pretty good sugar substitute. It's about 30 to 150 times sweeter than sugar. A lot of these natural sweeteners you can cook with or bake with, but don't expect it to, just be aware you're doing a magic trick, so to speak. Unless you may want to get a cookbook with these natural sweeteners with xylitol, and then they're out there to know how to cook with them. But for the most part, they may make the texture or whatever your baked good or whatever you cook with just a little bit different than what sucrose would be. So you just have to be aware of that. The thing I don't like about stevia is when you do raw stevia, it has kind of a bitter aftertaste. So that's the thing I don't like. But in Truvia, they're actually getting rid of that bitter taste because they're actually using one sweet compound. There's a number of compounds that make stevia sweet, but there's one compound called ributacide A, and that one doesn't really, when it's combined with the erythritol, certainly doesn't have that side effect or that aftertaste that you get. Stevia, it is considered, according to our FDA, it's considered very safe. It has that GRAS status, GRAS, generally regarded as safe. So it's one of those that, you'll find in our supermarkets here.
Thank God they're really looking out for us. GRA,
yeah,
generally regarded as safe.
Yeah, definitely. Right. And then there's the other one that I know I've seen in other products that's kind of a new kid on the block is sweeteners, but it is a natural sweetener, and it is called, it's called Lohan fruit or monk fruit sweetener. Have you heard of that?
We've definitely talked about the monk fruit before.
Yes. Okay. Well, that one is that's a low calorie sweetener. It's been used in traditional Chinese medicine, basically as, for diabetes and things like that. it is about 250 times sweeter than sugar, so that's why it's used, and it has a pleasant taste. I think aftertaste, especially compared to the artificial sweeteners. So that's another one you'll see out there, and that has a glycemic index of 0.
Mm.
All right. Um, there are many other ones out there that are on the market that you may see in Europe as sweeteners. I'm going to just go through the names. In the United States, you don't see them as much. Okay, and these are natural sweeteners, and a lot of them are derived from fruits of certain plants. One is called brazzein. Okay, that Brazzein. It's a sweet tasting protein that's extracted from a West African fruit of a plant called obli. All right. And so that one, believe it or not, is 500 to 2,000 times sweeter than sucrose. It's interesting when you read
Be
about,
careful.
yeah, it's interesting when you read about this one, but it's significantly very, very sweet. And so a little bit goes a long way. I have yet to see that used at all in the US. There's another one out there called Curculin. This is another sweet protein. It's isolated from a plant out of Malaysia called Curculigo. It's a very high intensity sweetener. It's a high intensity sweetener too, 430 to 2,070 times sweeter than sucrose on a weight basis. There's one called Miraculin, like miracle, and again, it's the berry from this plant is called miracle fruit. It is a glycoprotein, and it's from another plant, from the fruit of the plant called Syncyspalum disaficulum. Sorry for my pronunciation on that, but it's called Miraculum, Miraculin. Again, these things all have glycemic indexes of 0. There's other ones out there too, other sweet proteins out there. Monolin, that's from an African shrub called serendipity berry. It's another sweetener out there. And then there's another sweet tasting protein from the same plant that I said brazen was from the obli plant. And that one is called, where is it? It is called pentanin. Pentadin. It's just another sweet tasting protein. So a lot of these things are pretty cool because they're like amino acids, combinations of amino acids that can sweeten things.
Right. What stops these things from, being mass marketed or, in our food?
Well, I think a lot of it is just the FDA.
Mm.
A lot of these are marketed and being used and being researched and being used throughout the world in other countries. Most of these are generally regarded as safe. Most of these have a long history of use in hunter-gatherer cultures and have traditional use. So these will be on the market, and we'll be able to see these soon enough. All right, well, let's talk about the artificial sweeteners now. And my bias is, if and when you can, stay away from the artificial sweeteners. And that's my bias. And I just want to bring up that's my bias because I'm a naturopathic physician. And there you go. I'm on my soapbox for that. And what does that mean? Absolutely nothing. Okay. Because the research does show that many of these are well researched. One of them is aspartame. Saccharin is another one. They have pretty good research on them. And again, they have GRAS status. Sucralose is another one. So, I just bring that up because when I say, artificial sweeteners, or you hear the food gurus, the health nuts out there say they're bad for you and that type of thing. Well, not really according to research. It is true. Saccharin is one of these things that, has a, to me, you can definitely tell these artificial sweeteners from natural sweeteners, in my opinion. A lot of them have an active taste that aren't great at all. Like, for example, you hear like things like sucralose is actually like sucrose, but with chlorine molecules on it instead of OH groups. And that's true. All right. But according to the research, it's, and it's been researched quite a bit. It's not that doesn't seem to be that detrimental. But my bias says that, you know, you want to stick to things that are natural, that are that we kind of evolved with. And you're probably, you know, there's a big track record that you're probably going to do better with that than with some of these artificial sweeteners. But these artificial sweeteners have good research on them, and the FDA has looked at them and did their research. So whatever that means to people out there.
I appreciate the caveat.
Yeah. You've heard of aspartame, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another artificial sweetener. It's like 200 times sweeter than sucrose. Commonly used as a sugar substitute. I know most people have had that or tasted it. It is one of the most rigorously tested food ingredients there are. It has, you know, it's been tested over and over and over again. I mean, there's so many papers out on it. It, you know, basically has a negligible glycemic index. It is one of those things that can help people that need to want to have a sweet substitute, but don't want to add to their, you know, diabetes complications. And these things do help. But again,
right,
you want to avoid sweeteners if and when you can. Some of these fall under brand name. Like we know Sucrose is Splenda. Saccharin is under Sweet and Low. You heard of Sweet and Low, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. Aspartame is NutraSweet or Equal. So I just want to bring that up. And then there's another one out there that I've seen in drinks, like sports drinks and stuff, and like low calorie sodas. And I always get this name messed up, but it's I mean, it just has this weird chemical name. Aspartame K. I mean, can you pronounce that better than me? Do you know what I'm talking about there,
Definitely
Brian?
not.
Yeah. Anyway, it has a weird chemical name, but you'll see it. It's 200 times sweeter. I think it's aspartame. I don't know. I can't even get my tongue wrapped around it, but 200 times sweeter than sucrose.
Yeah, we got some interesting names here, Keoni.
Yeah.
If before the podcast you asked if I wanted to try any of your Yacon Syrup, I'd say no.
Right.
But I have a different opinion now.
Yeah, I mean, maybe since I'm having so much trouble pronouncing these chemical names, whether they're natural or not, I would say this: stay away from the more difficultly pronounced names of sweeteners. All right, and that tends to be the more synthetic. That tends to be the more synthetic ones. Anyway, this sweetener is it's mixed with other sweeteners to mask like aftertaste and things like that. A little bit goes a long way. I think we just scratched the surface of sweeteners out there that are used. All right. I just wanted to highlight the main ones out there. So it just gives people an idea of what we're dealing with. I mean, we live in a sugary world and a sweet world, and, you know, there's a lot of sweeteners out there that, depending on what you want from them, you know, they have a low glycemic index, especially if you're diabetic or need to keep it down. You may want to look at some of these low glycemic index sweeteners. If not, then I say, you know, use as condiment level or condiment doses some of these natural sweeteners. And, you know, some of them are really good. I really like coconut sugar. I think that's a great one. I think honey is a great one too. Don't be tricked into some of these sweeteners like we were talking about with like some of these packaged sweeteners that you find in the packs. A lot of them are packaged with maltodextrin, which actually has a higher glycemic index. So that's kind of crazy, you know, that they put it in there and market it as, you know, low glycemic index or not spiking your sugar, but yet it has maltodextrin in it. Mm-hmm. So just so people get an idea. Anyway.
And you would recommend Keoni natural sweeteners first and foremost. That's like your first go-to if you need it.
Yeah.
And follows through the natural and then just the synthetic ones after that. But in order, the synthetic ones go.
It depends on what you're doing, right? I mean, if you really want to, you know, if you're getting ready to run a marathon and you want to load with something, have a quick energy source, you know, honey is great. It can be really useful for that.
In that instance, you want more glucose as well.
Yeah.
That's what you're trying
Yeah.
to
Well, you want, yes, you do. It's going to be, it's going to be metabolized quicker. And then with high fructose corn syrup, it's very similar to sucrose. So as far as its chemical composition, but there are different high fructose corn syrups out there. So just know what you're getting. Most of the stuff in the food store is close to 50% fructose, 50% glucose, right? Like sucrose is. Um, honey, it's a great sweetener. You definitely want to be careful with it though. I think coconut sugar is also another great sweetener. But if you want to get away from adding to, possibly raising your blood sugar, raising your lipids and things like that, then you can go to something that's like a sugar alcohol, like erythritol, which is found in Truvia or Stevia. And that stuff, it has 6% of the calories of regular sugar, but still contains this, essentially the same amount of sweetness.
Right.
So that's a good way to go. And erythritol really doesn't give you the digestive upset of other sugar alcohols.
Right.
Sorbitol and maltitol are kind of the worst. I've had experiences with that. And man, you want to get your bowels moving, just eat a bunch of that. And I had experience with that, with chocolate sweetened with that. And I'm a chocolate fiend, unfortunately. And that's my go-to drug of choice. And I was thinking I was doing my body good way back when, eating some of these low-cal chocolate bars that are highly sweet with sorbitol and maltitol. And if you're not used to it, there is an acclimating effect. But if you're not used to it and you eat too much, you're gonna have a severe digestive upset and be very uncomfortable, and people will not want to be around you. I can tell you that. So yeah, it does a number on your colon. Let's just leave it at that. What else? Anything else we should talk about with this?
That was really it. Quite an education. Like I said, a lot of names, a lot of information that you get to digest there. I definitely wouldn't have known what the Yacon syrup was before.
Yeah.
But it gives you a good idea of kind of when you're going through the grocery store that you definitely at least want more of these natural sweeteners first and foremost, and then your secondary options that we just kind of ran through and all the reasons why they may or may not be more useful.
Yeah, and I want to just be clear on this is that these synthetic sweeteners are out there. They, as far as science goes, they have been well studied, okay? And most of them, including sucralose, saccharin, and all of them, have really been well studied. I think there have been some bumps in the road with some of the research, especially with, I think it was either sucralose or saccharin, and where they did in animal studies where it seemed to be problematic, but it was basically problematic based on the animal they were researching and their physiology and not so much human physiology. And I think the FDA really wanted it pulled off the market, but then subsequently put it back on the market. I think both sucrose and saccharin, because showed that it was actually very, very safe in humans. But my bias is, when in doubt, go with the natural stuff. But be aware of what you're getting with that natural stuff too. So like we said at the beginning, right? A lot of honey in the stores is cut with fructose. So you may be getting a lot more fructose in store-bought honey than you actually you actually think
is a burden on your liver.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, too much can certainly be a big burden on your liver, because a lot of people, they get their sweetener, like their high fructose corn syrup, but then they're eating their starchy tubers and eating regular meals and things like that, and they've already pushed their energy intake well beyond what they should have for the day. And what does that lead to? Excess calories leads to excess fat. It gives us helps promote the diseases of the modern day. Heart disease, diabetes, cancer, so on and so on. So that's why I say, really try to get away from the sweet taste. And if you really want to get your carbohydrate in, do it with the starchy carbs, but also do it in small amounts, especially potatoes. And, even rice has a high satiety index, more so than these monosaccharides or disaccharides do, but white potato is way up there. It's one of the most satiating things. So it can help you feel full longer. And what's more important, if you feel satiated, then that's what's more important than, taking a sweetener in, which can actually stimulate your appetite long after you've already taken it, you know,
Mhm.
even if it doesn't spike your sugar, you get this cephalic effect where your brain thinks you're getting calories, but you're not. So then it craves more food later.
Mm.
So that's the other problem. That may be the other problem with these sweeteners.
Yeah.
Anyway, I hope that gave some education on sweeteners for people to just get a little bit of better understanding for it on them.
Absolutely.
I wish we would have done it earlier in our podcast series, but no, better late than never. So we got it in.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will talk with you next week, sweetie.
Take care. All right. Bye.